So yes, give you the client perspective on how vendors are selected in big organizations. And I will also at the very end talk about the challenges that this poses to our organization. So Oracle is a bit particular in that sense that the IPS organization, which is International Product Solutions Department, which takes care of translation, is actually part of the development group at Oracle. And I think it's quite a unique setup in the industry in that sense that we are a sort of translation company within the company. It's a group of 200 people. I mentioned earlier on the 60 language-related people based in the countries who deal with vendors and take care of quality assurance. We also have a group of engineers who manage and set up all our translation environment, which is highly automated, as you can imagine, and project management and vendor management groups based primarily in Dublin. So, before digging into, the criteria that we use and what we expect from vendors, I think it's very important to try to explain and to look at the way we run our business based on our own internal organization. And I guess this is what all companies do, all major companies, in that sense that before going out shopping, so to speak, we need to understand what we want to do. We need to understand what kind of support we will provide to our vendors. There are some companies who simply outsource and they let the vendors handle everything. Do we want to stay, let's say, a bit in control? Do we want to check the quality delivered by the vendors? Do we have people internally who are able to do that? Is the company ready to invest into resources, equipment, in order to support the translation business? So there are quite a few specifics that are internal to the company itself that have to be taken into account before we go into looking for vendors. So in addition to that, obviously Oracle is an IT company, so we do have our own requirements related to the type of contents that we translate. The translation organization, IPS group, translates all software, IT, UI, UA, and also all the Oracle University material, that is to say the tutorials and the training material that are delivered to customers. And we translate into 43 languages, plus some other occasionally. So it's quite a big team and quite a large span of activities, so to speak. So the contents that we translate is sensitive, but there are probably other big companies who have other requirements in terms of confidentiality. We were talking this morning in the session over there about medical confidentiality, healthcare. They may have other type of requirements compared to Oracle. Confidentiality for us is not that seriously important, even though, of course, we want to protect our translation assets, and we do that seriously with our internal tools and servers. We also, of course, have to take into account the expertise that we expect our vendors to deliver. Oracle Corporation delivers more than 1,000 products worldwide in 43 languages, covering the complete business flow of any enterprise, ranging from CRM to HR, through finance, accounting, healthcare, also some niche software that are destined to specific companies. So the range of expertise that we look for is extremely wide. When it comes to marketing contents, just to give you also a piece of information there, this is not handled by IPS. It's handled directly by Oracle Corporation Marketing Department, and they are a separate organization from us. I have learned very recently that the whole of marketing contents is now translated through neural machine translation without any manual intervention. So that's an interesting piece of information related to what we discussed earlier on today. Another piece of information that is important when you want to define your internal requirements for vendors is to figure out, okay, who is going to monitor that? Who is going to do the job? Do I want to outsource all my translation work, as I was saying earlier on, without monitoring anything? Do I fully want to trust my vendors and the product will directly go out to the market? This is not the case with us. As I explained earlier on, we are a kind of translation organization, a translation agency, so to speak, within Oracle. So quality is super important for our executives. That's why they have invested in setting up our group to take care of quality assurance. So this is typically a task that will remain internal to us and which will not be outsourced to vendors, even though we do have definitely quality expectations, which are extremely detailed, as I will mention later on. The other thing that takes precedence when we want to hire vendors is whether we want to outsource everything or do we want to keep some stuff inside. As far as we are concerned, we progressively went out to a fully outsourced model, meaning we do not translate within Oracle. The whole translation work, and we're talking here about billions of words, is fully outsourced to vendors. The other thing that also have to be taken into account is whether we want to go with a single vendor solution for all languages, or do we prefer to go with one vendor per language, or are we okay to outsource translations of a couple of languages to the same vendor? Are we more in favor of an SLV scenario, as you were mentioning, Tatiana, or to an MLV scenario? And in fact, here, the approach taken by Oracle is very opportunistic. We don't have any preference. We go with the vendor that meets our expectations, whether it's an SLV, a single language vendor, who will meet the requirements that will be described after that, or we will go with an MLV if this is the best solution for the market and for the language. So, going backwards. So these are the main criteria that are considered from an internal perspective. Once we have designed these kind of requirements, then we can start going, and investigate what's available, let's say, on the localization market. So the criteria that you can see here on screen are actually a must, I would say, for all major corporations with regular and very high translation volumes. These are language-independent criteria. So we are not here talking about, let's say, language quality expectations. It's really about the business. What kind of companies do we want to partner with? So there are here a series of, let's say, indicators that you can read. The presence on the market, by that we mean, is the company, let's say, present on the market since a long time? Do they have a track record and do they have references on dealing with other major actors of the industry in translating contents? This is a very important part for us. We definitely would not go right away for companies that have just been set up because of the volume we are talking about and because of the very high demand that we have on turnovers. So we would need to work with companies that are established since a while, who are used to dealing with high volumes and high expectations. We also look for reputation. So this is something we would inquire about. At the very beginning, when Oracle started to outsource, we were a bit resistant, let's say, reluctant to partner with companies who were working with our competitors, for the sake of confidentiality. That was, I would say, 20 years ago. But now this approach has changed because the fact that we do have vendors who work with our competitors actually bring in expertise. Even though the domain might be similar, the contents may be similar, but obviously the companies we want to work with are professionals. They are obviously taking care of confidentiality. They sign NDA agreements with their customers. So we know that they will not, let's say, mess up and share information across customers. So the fact that a vendor has experience, let's say, in a similar domain than Oracle is a plus now. Domain knowledge, obviously, as I mentioned, we are dealing with hundreds of thousands of different type of contents and domain activities. So we also look for companies who are able to deliver quality and who have knowledge in ERP, in CRM, in HR, in all that kind of products that are part of the Oracle portfolio. The third criteria, which is obviously critically important, is the financial profile and the strategy of the company. This is something which is quite specific to Oracle, as far as I know. We prefer to partner with companies who are willing to grow. The reason behind that is that our translation volumes are definitely increasing after time. It's a bit slowing down now, thanks to the technology. But basically, we are looking for partners who do not want to remain a small unit. We are looking for partners who are ambitious, who want to grow in their industry, who want to become industry leaders in their field. For us, that's how can I say that? It's a signal that the company is very proactive, willing to understand, willing to improve, willing to grow. This is a positive signal for us. We also look at the revenue of the company, how the revenue is split among their customers. We do not want to be the single client of these companies. It's important for us and it's important for the company. Basically, we do that for the sake of the company itself, because if for some reason we have a decrease in volume, we have a decrease in business, we don't want the company to be jeopardized by that. So we would definitely look for and ask for information about the revenue of the vendor that we are considering. What is your revenue split between your vendors? Do you have any customer who is primarily occupying, let's say, 70% of the revenue? If ever Oracle joins your portfolio of customers, are we going to become the major client? This is something that we pay a lot of attention to, because that's not what we want. And it's really for the sake, let's say, of the company itself, so that the company doesn't go bankrupt. Let's say if for some reason or another, the volume of work diminishes. This is very important. Production capacity, I guess that this is also something you may be familiar with. We want to deal with partners who are able to cope with very high volumes. For some languages, like the famous major ones, so to speak, simplified Chinese, French, German, Spanish, we translate more than 20 million words sometimes per month, per quarter. It's a lot. So we really will to come, and it can be the exact opposite the following quarter. So we really are looking for partners who are able to adjust seamlessly for us. We don't want to know. We just want you to deal with the volumes and deliver according to the required turnaround times. So it's quite demanding, but this is important for us to figure out, whether the capacity of the production unit will follow what we will send for translation. Of course, this also relates to the very short deadlines. I mean, since I would say maybe 15, 20 years now, Oracle is working on a SIM-ship model, meaning that we deliver all translated versions of the software at the same time, no matter the language and no matter the release. So this imposes quite some challenges technically for us. Of course, we need to make sure that our translation factory, as we call it, is able to support that. And we have automated our complete translation workflow from Oracle towards our providers, so that there is a constant flow of translation going back and forth. So this imposes as well some constraints and restrictions, let's say, on the way we do business with vendors. We really want to have vendors who are a bit mirroring, let's say, our organization. And of course, but that's a standard in the industry. I mean, reactivity to schedule changes is also critical. We can, as I was saying, we may have from one quarter millions of words to translate, and much less the following quarter. So what's going to happen to the team that the vendor is supposed to put in place in order to support our requirements? This is something that we investigate as well very detailedly. The team setup. Because we also have, as I mentioned, internal resources, we do have some specific team setup requirements. For instance, we would, but that's a given maybe for you guys, but not necessarily across the board. We want the translators to be native speakers. and to live in the country of the target language. You can be, I don't know, a Swedish translator living in Canada. If you translate into Swedish, you may lose, let's say, the current terminology which is ongoing and happening and taking place in Sweden, for instance. So it's very important for us that the local translators are native speakers and based in the country that we are targeting. We also, of course, expect these people to be professional translators. I mean, we would not hire, unless there is no other option, of course, and we'll talk about that in the challenges, we would not hire someone who doesn't have a linguistic background. Or we would ask the vendor to confirm to us that their translators are all linguists and experienced reviewers. We experienced preferably, at least for the key roles, such as the people in charge of proofreading, of reviews, the key personnel in the organization. We would also require the presence of a local team with permanent employees. We want the key roles in the vendors to be employees of the organization, not freelancers who are hired on an on-demand basis depending on the product or on the projects. So typical roles would be project management. Because the setup is quite complex, the way we operate is very dynamic, is very tensed. We would prefer that the project managers are always the same people. We want to retain knowledge within the vendor organization, and we monitor that. So that's part of the requirements. We want the key roles in project management to be permanent employees of the company. Likewise, with the people in charge of review, of quality assurance, proofreading, no matter how you want to call it. The translators can be, of course, freelancers, because we do not want either to work with companies who have armies of translators on site. That's not very economical. It's not a sustainable model. So we can definitely understand, and that's the way the whole industry works, actually, that freelancers are involved in projects with big companies, but they are not necessarily employees. That's okay. However, with the key roles related to review, who are interacting closely with our own language people, we want them to be internal resources. Again, it's a matter of maintaining knowledge. We do spend a lot of time training our vendors because the domain is complex. The way we operate is quite sophisticated. We do not want to reinvent the wheel each time we have a new project. Obviously, this may happen that people leave the company, but we would also ask the vendors to have a way to ensure that when someone is leaving, the person who will take over will know what they are talking about. We don't want to train the vendors. Or we do it exceptionally, of course, when we get started, or when we have a major change in our own translation environment. For instance, new translation tools, new methods, new requirements, new setups. Of course, we do train the people there. But apart from that, we expect the vendor to monitor how knowledge is managed within the organization. It's really about, making sure that the internal team has expertise. It also relates to not only technicalities, but how to handle terminology, how to handle questions. We do have quite sophisticated systems of exchanging questions and answers with our vendors through databases, in the cloud, that all vendors can access. For instance, if there is a question on a specific project from the Russian vendor, the answer that is given by the Russian language specialist is made available to all languages. So there is this story of, working in silos depending on the language. It's really a shared community, let's say. Oh, sorry. I'm not fully finished with this one. Quality assurance, as we said, we also inquire whether the company is ISO certified. This doesn't mean that the quality will be perfect, but it's a signal of reassurance for us that quality is something which is important for the vendor. That there are processes in place, that there are documented approaches, that the whole system exists in order to ensure a certain level of quality. The rest is, let's say, our own internal business, so to speak. But the fact that the vendor is ISO certified shows us that, okay, there is awareness in this company that quality is important and that it has been addressed. When it comes to knowledge management, as I explained earlier on, we want to make sure that whenever someone leaves in the company, the knowledge will be retained, and that it will be a transparent operation for us. So if there is a change in project management team internally, or if the key reviewer leaves the company, of course that's acceptable. At the end of the day, ultimately, we don't want to hear about it, but we don't want to notice that there is a difference. That's very important. When it comes to the technical infrastructure, we also have quite specific requirements because we work through a completely integrated end-to-end translation workflow, as I mentioned, from Oracle product development to the vendors. It's all automated, to the vendors and back. So we want to make sure that the technical infrastructure at the vendor side, the number of servers, the capacity of the lines will be able to support the very strong reactivity and the performance that we ask for. This is critical, very important. It's quite sensitive, particularly as well with regards to the security of the networks. Even though, as I mentioned earlier on, the data is not, let's say, super confidential that it might be for medical care or nuclear factories or whatever, but we want to make sure that there is security. And we investigate and we go and visit vendors to make sure that they have security in their premises, that they have backup plans, that everything that we translate is backed up at least once a day, etc. So this is very serious. And just to give you an anecdote, recently, maybe you remember, there was a revolution in the Arab world. We had the Arab Spring revolution 2 years ago, and we are still working with the vendor in Egypt. And because there were riots, there were, strikes, and the situation was very damageable, let's say, in general, we went there to check that everything was safe for our data. This is very important for us. Of course, we do have internal backup for everything, but we also wanted to ensure that the company itself would pay attention to how to protect their own assets. That's very important. And the last word about that, which I put in red, because that's probably, for me at least, the most important one. Are we going to work well together? It's very important that the chemistry between the people is valuable and that we'll have good cooperation. As I will mention also later on, you will see that when we deal with vendors, we do not simply consider them as providers. We are working with vendors since 20 plus years. It's the case for Logros, and it's the case with the majority of our partners, actually. We really build a partnership. It's not only about, I send you stuff to translate and you deliver it back. It's really about working together on understanding what the requirements are, understanding what we need, understanding what you need, and trying to improve the overall situation. So the fact that people can communicate and work together well is absolutely essential. I don't think that we would work and go to a company who would have all these, items ticked off in green if we didn't have a good feeling about the people. We still believe, and I think that we discussed that a bit this morning, that it is a human activity. So having the people getting along well, understanding each other, being able to speak the same language is absolutely essential. So if all these criteria are met, then there is no need to do a translation test. We don't do that. We don't ask for translation tests. We go straight away with a pilot project in real life conditions that is delivered to our customers. We don't have time to waste to review, check what has been translated, whether the quality is there, blah, blah, blah. We give all the means to do a good job. We know that it's going to be the first project, so definitely not super perfect, that's okay. But we don't go with translation tests. We don't feel the need for it because all these check boxes have been ticked. So this is in very few words the way we select vendors. Now, when it comes to the challenges, I will be very open about that as well, because that's the way we work in general. We are in full transparency. The challenges that we meet is when we go to markets where the localization or translation industry is not mature. We are going to translate for the first time ever in a new language, and there are no translators there. The market doesn't exist. There are no universities training students to become translators. How do we manage that? So this is indeed a bit of a challenge for us. So we do have a couple of, let's say, solutions. We would definitely turn towards our partners, existing partners, who may have some experience in these languages. So we would not necessarily go ourselves, let's say, looking for vendors, but we would ask our key partners, do you have anybody who would be able to handle Urdu, for instance, for us? Knowing our requirements, would you be able to deliver that for us? So that's the way we would definitely investigate when we do have that kind of situations where the translation industry is not very mature. We would be, of course, looking for professionals if we can, but it may happen that we don't find professionals. So we would go to experts of the domain who may have, you know, a bit of English knowledge, so to speak, and who might be able to still, you know, deliver a certain level of quality. It hasn't happened so far, but this is something that we definitely pay attention to when we go for a new, what we call exotic languages. There are a few. It depends on how the business works at Oracle. Definitely, what makes us, you know, go ahead with a new language is when we have a deal that has been signed with an administration, because this is usually a requirement that the kind of software that Oracle delivers, let's say ERP or administrative, if we sell, let's say, these licenses to public authorities, to administrations, they would typically require a translated version. So this is why we would have situations where we have to go to new markets where there is no translation industry, but we have signed the deal and they want the translation in their language. So we have to find a way. As I said, we definitely would look at our existing partners to try to find a solution, if possible, and that's the way it has been working so far. There is also another element there when we deal with emerging markets, is the fact that sometimes the terminology of the domain which is being addressed by the software does not exist. It's a brand new technology. We had the case several times when we were starting to translate our ERP software 15 years ago in some markets and some countries. There was simply no terminology. They didn't know how to translate ERP. They didn't know how to translate work in progress or, you know, backward scheduling. The notions simply did not exist in the culture, in the country. So this is also something that we pay a lot of attention to, and that requires a lot of investment. With the vendor on our side, we would set up terminology brainstorming groups, let's say, with experts of the market, generally people from Oracle who know the software very well, and our vendors to try to figure out, okay, how are we going to translate that into this language? That's the way we work for that. And sometimes, as we were discussing this morning with some of you, we simply use the English word because there is no other option, and we need to be let's say, to move on with the delivery of the translations. And these words, later on, we might decide to translate them afterwards because the industry is maturing, the other competitors are coming on this market as well. It happened maybe a while ago, you remember, with the Microsoft dictionaries, where they invented these terms, Windows and mouse or whatever, and it's not really a mouse, so how are we going to translate that into the languages? That was a long time ago, but it's a bit of a similar, let's say, situation that we face sometimes when we try to translate Oracle software, which is high-tech, very much in advance technologically on the market, and there is simply no terminology. We have to do something about that. So this is one of the challenges that we face. Another challenge that we face as well is to deal with cultural differences. When we go, I mean, Oracle is a multinational, very American-like, I would say. So maybe that's not really fair to say that, but you know, the Americans, they consider that English is the only language in the world, you know, and translation is not really important. So when we go to look for some providers, we need to be very mindful of the cultural differences and not come up with, you know, our portfolio and our dollars, let's say, and try to simply, you know, okay, I'm going to buy this and you're going to deliver that back to me. That's not the way it works in some cases. We need to be very mindful and aware of the cultural differences in some countries. We also need to be careful when it comes to translation itself, that there are some specificities in some cultures that are simply not translatable, either because it would be offending to the customers, or because it is something that doesn't exist. It refers to the terminology point I was mentioning earlier on, you know. But this is something that requires, from a vendor selection process point of view, a lot of investigation. So we would pay attention to that. We would try to adapt the examples, for instance, that we give in our iHelp documents, in the user assistance documents. We pay a lot of attention not to refer to alcoholic beverages, for instance, when we translate some specific software into Muslim countries. This is something which is important, so we need to take that into account, that kind of thing. So this is really important because it can really be a showstopper. I mean, if we are not mindful, if we are not tactful in the way we first try to start a relationship with the vendor, this can really, you know, jeopardize completely the relationship. So we pay a lot of attention to that. We need to prepare. And it's not only for the quality of the translation, it's also for the quality of the business relation with the vendor. As I mentioned earlier on, I mean, the chemistry between the people for us is essential. So this is something that we really pay a lot of attention to. Performance. So this is not directly related, but it is to an extent with the vendor selection process, because if I am going to buy translation services, how am I going to make sure that I get value for my money? How am I going to make sure that all the criteria that I mentioned earlier on are satisfactorily addressed? So it is something that we do investigate, and this is part of our, not really vendor selection process, but it's a side product, let's say. It's part of the vendor management process in general. And it's a key constituent of the way we operate with vendors. So how can I check that this vendor meets my expectations? I'm not going to review the hundreds of thousands of words that they are going to deliver. I need to find another way to do that. And in order to do that, we do that with vendors. We cooperate with our partners to put together in place a model that will help us to measure their performance. We do that together. So we've set up an infrastructure together with them to support the performance evaluation. I'm going to say a few words about that. And this is what we call a virtuous circle. So this virtuous circle is really about how to measure performance, and it's basically composed of two subsets, so to speak. We define our criteria based on the factors that we use, what is the type of audience that we are targeting as our customers. And of course, we do use as well the linguistic standards that you are probably all familiar with. I mean, that used to be a part of the LISA model maybe 20 years ago, and which are now also handled and proposed by TAOS, by DQF, etc. These are the quality linguistic standards, I suppose that you are more or less familiar with that. But when we define standards which are based on our requirements, we also need to go with measurement. And the performance measurement should not only cover the linguistic aspect, but also the rest, all the other criteria that you have seen. So this is I hope that the colors are legible. I'm not sure. You will tell me. Is that okay? Can you read the colors? Not really? Okay. I will change the color of the font later on. Basically, a QA, a virtuous circle, is meant to, how can we make sure that the errors do not repeat over time? So it goes a bit beyond simple, let's say, measurement, or performance measurement. It's a very powerful tool that we have developed together with some of our vendors to ensure that there is a continuous and constant matching between what we want and what we get, between what we plan to have and what we actually get as results. So, and it's also a very healthy and useful picture for us from a company point of view, because we can make sure that, okay, this is how the performance works, let's say, in terms of vendors, but I can also figure out, for this language, what is the overall performance of my vendors? Because we do not only, in some languages, in majority actually, we have more than one vendor per language. We do have two in general, and for the languages that are most busy, like simplified Chinese, French, German, we do have up to 5 vendors because of the volumes. And so we do have a lot of work to be done in terms of consistency, but also in terms of management of all this data. So this quality virtuous circle that you can see here starts actually with the pie, which is in yellow, which is the definition of the rules. Okay, so the linguistic criteria, this is what we define, as I said earlier on, through the standards of the industry. You may have heard about the LISA model, as I said, the DQF model, where we have a series of indicators, and there is an allowed number of errors for every, I don't know, 10,000 words, for instance. So these criteria are accuracy. What else do we have? I've took note of that. Accuracy, adequation to country standards, terminology, etc. So just to make sure that the language is okay, and that we would count by sampling the translations, the number of errors that are allowed. So this is not only what we do, because we also use a similar approach for the non-linguistic standards. So these non-linguistic standards are those that relate to the criteria I mentioned earlier on. We want a company to be able to deliver, according to our requirements in terms of turnaround times. We are going to measure that. Is the vendor able to deliver 10,000 words a week as we ask for? So this is measured, and it's embedded in our translation workflow. We also measure the quality of the communications within the team. How many times, how long does it take to a vendor to answer one of our questions? And likewise, we would measure ourselves against that. How long does it take us to answer a vendor question? So all these questions, all these criteria have been established in cooperation with our vendors, and this is measured continuously. We would also obviously measure the quality of the deliverables, because the process, as I mentioned, is highly automated. The files are going back and forth without any manual intervention within IPS. So we want to make sure that obviously the files that are delivered back are not faulty, that they will be integrated by development safely and smoothly into the final product. So we do measure that as well, whether we have faulty deliveries. And we have a tolerance threshold. We may allow, I don't know, 1 error every, I'm talking out of the blue here, 500 files, for instance. So this is something that we measure, and that's part of the criteria. We would also measure the number of and the type of the questions that we are asked. Referring to the knowledge management element I mentioned earlier on, we would figure out whether the questions that are asked by the vendor about what they are translating, they may have questions, I don't understand this term, what does that mean? We would measure whether the question is relevant or not. Because by what we mean by that is, has this question already been asked 2 weeks ago? Or have they really read the answer that was provided for another language 2 days ago? So that's the kind of thing we would monitor, because that tells us that there is a good knowledge management system at the vendor side. As I explained earlier on, all the questions and all the answers are made available to everybody. So we expect the vendors, and we pay them for that, to monitor the kind of questions that are asked by the others, and to see whether, if they have the same question, maybe the answer is already there. and that can help them. So this poses as well quite a challenge on us, because we need to make sure that our answers can be used by vendors of other languages. So if my Turkish vendor tells me, how can I translate that? I don't understand the word. I'm not going to give him the Turkish translation. I'm going to tell them, this is what it means, and you find the translation. Because this is the type of answer that can be used by the German vendor. And they will find the term if they have the question. So it's quite a sophisticated approach, but that allows us to monitor performance quite effectively. And again, this is all through databases that are integrated. So we do have our performance evaluation system embedded into all our tools, all the tools that are used for the translation process. So all these KPIs, as we call them, key performance indicators, are specific. They are all measurable. They are achievable, and they are realistic and time-bound. And we define them with the vendors. So the vendors know what we expect. They know that they cannot, that if they ask, I don't know, more than, if they fail more than 5 deliveries every quarter, they might be in trouble. So they know what the expectations are, and these standards are shared with them. There is nothing secret there. So, as I said, this is embedded into all our tools and systems, and all this performance data is consolidated into a major system, which is our performance evaluation system, where we would take as a principle, let's say, that no news is good news. If there is nothing tracked, it means that the vendor is doing a splendid job and they deliver everything on time with the right quality without any issues. So a 0, let's say, level is the best. If we start tracking errors, then we might investigate what's going on there. And this is measured regularly on a project basis with each vendor. When we have a major project ongoing, at the end of the project, we will set up a meeting with the vendor to discuss what happened with this project. And on quarterly basis, we have business reviews with the owners, or let's say the people responsible at the vendor side, to discuss the overall performance. That's the way it works. So it's quite a sophisticated and complex system, as you can understand, but that's the best way for us to measure performance and to make sure that the way we have selected this vendor was actually the right decision for us to make. So this is just a little bit of a conclusion, I would say, about what I mentioned earlier on, in that sense that we build partnership with our vendors. We simply cannot afford to change vendor for every project. So what we want to do is really build a very solid relationship with the vendors and have a real vendor partnership collaboration. Because standards are just standards if you don't make efficient use and intelligent use of them. You need to actively work on your standards, make sure that they are understood, and we do spend a lot of time explaining our requirements to vendors. I will spare you the number of, meetings that the vendors on the review side have with our language people when they have to discuss about the quality of a specific product. It can, be quite time-consuming, but we believe it's an absolute must to make sure that we are all on the same page and that people understand what we expect. This is very important. And this requires a lot of investment from us. So we do share our vision, which I have tried to summarize here for you today. We do explain why we do things and how we do things. We explain the impact of issues on our own customers so that it's in full transparency that our translation partners know what to do and know how we want things to be done, and that there is always a good reason. It's not out of the blue. It's not because we want things to be perfect. It's because we do have a very good reason to do things in a certain way. We do provide a lot of training, extensive training to vendors, as I mentioned. When we start with a new partner, we would typically send one of our people or two for 1 week to the vendor just to train them. So this is an investment that we do whenever we start either with a new vendor or with a new language. We also support the vendor extensively. As I was mentioning, we do have a very solid and robust Q&A, question and answers system, which is shared across the board, across all vendors and all languages. And communication, of course, is critical. As I said, we do have regular project review meetings and quarterly business reviews with each single vendor. And we work with more than 60. So yes, continuous interaction and trust. Trust is absolutely key to the success of all this organization. And it's also part of the vendor selection process, as you may have understood, that the way we deal with people is fundamentally human. We are all human beings. And one of the assets, let's say, if I can say so, at Oracle is that we are on the same boat as you guys, let's say, because we do the same job. We are all translators. We are all engineers. We know when you have an issue where this comes from. We understand your language. You understand the way we explain our requirements. So this helps a lot. It's a bit of a privilege, I would say, that Oracle is really organized that way. But from my personal experience, I've never met any similar setup in any of the big companies I've been familiar with so far. And that's the way I think it helps us to be successful. So I think that's it. And maybe we can take 4 questions, if there is any, or comments.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm Fedor from Logros IT. So I have a question. Did you ever have a need to change one of your existing suppliers because the existing suppliers did not perhaps want or were not able to shift to machine translation?
As far as I know, this hasn't happened yet.
So everybody is okay?
Yes. And again, I think it relates to the fact that we give a lot of freedom to vendors. Of course, we do have our own translation tools, as you know. If you work with Logros, you know.
Yes, I do.
But at the end of the day, we have slightly changed our approach there a couple of years ago. We were requiring every vendor to use HyperHub, to use Translation Factory, etc. Now the focus has changed a bit in that sense that what we focus on is the end result. If the file format is compatible with our systems, the vendor can use whatever system they want. They can externalize what we send them, translate them in their own translation tools. We provide APIs as well in order to help the vendors if they do not want to use Oracle tools, which may happen because they are, again, resource-consuming, big systems. This is a shift that happened quite recently, actually. And so it's a possibility, yes. But because we give up freedom, a certain level of freedom, of course we control that. It's not completely, open. But because the vendors can actually externalize what we send them to translate, do their own, let's say, kitchen, whatever recipe they want to do on the files and deliver back, as long as it's in the right format for us, we're happy.
That's the best approach I've ever seen. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
What about feedback from your clients? Do you always expect feedback from them, or do you just receive it when it comes?
Exactly, that's the approach. Because we are dealing with more than 500,000 customers, we do not go to even a specific set of customers to ask for feedback. We do have bug databases, as all IT companies have. And whenever we have feedback in these bug databases saying, well, this translation is absolutely crap, you need to rework it, or it doesn't make sense, then that's the way we would collect vendor feedback.
And are you then on your own translators, your own vendor side, and you think, well, it might be the client that is too...
Absolutely. Before, we always investigate the vendor complaints, so to speak. So indeed, there are some cases where the vendor, or the client, let's say, would prefer another term, But we do the investigation ourselves. Our language people, they would investigate the bug. And if they notice that it's just a preference, because the vendor, the client is used to their own jargon, or they use a certain term in their business, but that's not the approved official terminology, then for us it's not a bug, it's a preference. And we do that systematically for all the translation bugs that we receive.
And do you then record some feedback on the on your vendor's profile? So
yes,
yeah.
as I mentioned, we do have this performance evaluation system, which is a measurement system. And on a quarterly basis, we would discuss with the vendor, okay, this quarter you've done a super good job. There have been no issues. Congratulations. Talk to you next time, you know. But it may happen that, okay, there has been quite a few translation issues last quarter. Can we work together on an action plan? Can you explain to us what happened? Is there anything we can do to help you? Do you know why it happened? That's the way we deal with that.
I have a question. You mentioned that you have sometimes large volumes of
Yes.
to be completed and translated. Do you allow your vendors sometimes to outsource some of that flow if the volume is really high, or it has to be done in-house?
It depends. Again, it's the same strategy as for the translation tools. As long as the material delivered back is of good quality and on time, we don't care. If the vendor wants to outsource to another vendor, and I know that it happens, it's okay. It's their decision. They are fully responsible and they own the way they handle the business for us.
Yes, but sometimes...
No. Could you please...
Sometimes if they do outsource part of the work, you tend to find those other freelancers mentioning on their website platforms that they are vendors for Oracle as well.
Then it's an issue, or it's something that our vendor...
I've seen it.
I know,
yeah.
But that's something that the vendor is supposed to address, not us.
Okay.
The vendor is responsible for whom they work with. They can apply actually the same criteria, and I know that some do that. They simply replicate the way we do things with their own partners, and that's okay.
A quick technical question. You mentioned SimShip. So
yes.
My question is, how quickly did you deliver localization versions after US product was delivered?
At the same time.
24 hours?
24 hours on the
or
same.
3 days or
no,
5? 24
time.
hours.
Yes, we
because,
do.
Because 0 hours, it's not impossible. 24 hours, I believe into this.
No, we do that at the same time. And the reason behind that, I'm not going to go into too much technicalities, is that we don't wait for an English version to be ready in order to translate it. We translate bits and pieces of software continuously, all the time.
And another question, it's about full cycle localization. Is it a requirement for your vendors to provide full cycle or not?
What do you mean by full cycle?
To do everything, translation, software engineering, quality assurance, so all the stuff, all the pieces. So
yeah, actually, we do have a standard price list that describes very detailedly what we want the vendor to do. So this, I'm not sure whether it relates to localization. Localization at Oracle is something quite special. Let's say it's not translation. It's really, looking into the code and changing the standards. This is done internally at Oracle. This is not outsourced. This is done by product development. And it is embedded in the core product, meaning that if you install, I don't know, the English version on your machine, and your French subsidiary wants to install the same version on their machine, they will instantly get, the correct date and decimals for French.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Alexander Bondarenko.
Oh,
yes, and I represent Translatel company, Ukraine. So I have a very provocative question. As I both represent academia and industry, also teaching at Ukrainian local university translation. In the first part of your presentation, you mentioned that you insist that your vendors prove that their translators are professional linguists. Being also at the part of academia, I know that not only in Ukraine, but in other many European countries, it means not very much. So professional linguists are not always good translators. So does it make sense? Or maybe it's more reasonable to take some more pragmatic criteria, like expertise, experience in the field, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, it's a mix actually, and again, because we are on the customer side, so to speak, we would not investigate into that level of detail. We would expect the vendors to do that for us. So if we ask our vendors, we want you to hire, we want to make sure that the key personnel in your team, the key reviewers are professionals, it's their job to make sure that they are. And that's just part of the requirements. If they find someone who is very good, but not a linguist, I'm happy with that, as long as the quality is there.
Claire, thank you so much. And
Thanks to
indeed,
you guys.
anyone, please.